I woke up to the soft hum of sunlight streaming through the blinds, my head buried in a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The comforting weight of my blanket, the rhythmic tick of my bedside clock, and the faint chirping of birds outside created a serene cocoon. But as I stretched, I felt a grit beneath my feet. Frowning, I pulled back the blanket to reveal something that sent my groggy mind into overdrive. My sneakers, still on, caked in mud. My first thought was that it had rained during the night, but then came the second, more troubling realization. Why were my shoes muddy if I'd gone to bed? My jeans, still on, were damp at the hem, and my hands had faint smudges of dirt. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat up, scanning the room. My phone rested on the nightstand, and everything else looked undisturbed, but my memories of the night before were suspiciously absent. Swinging my legs off the bed, I felt something heavy in my pocket. Reaching in, I pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and a handful of oddities, a café receipt, a green marble, and a matchbox with a cartoon duck on it. The receipt was the first thing I examined. It was from a place called Lila's Café, dated last night at 11:47 p.m. The items listed: 1 black coffee and a slice of lemon pie. The thing was, I didn't drink coffee, and I definitely didn't eat pie. I paced the room, trying to make sense of the scene. I'd gone to bed at my usual time, somewhere around 10. I distinctly remembered brushing my teeth, scrolling through my phone, and then drifting off to sleep. Yet here I was, with dirty shoes, a pocket full of mysteries, and no recollection of what I'd done after tucking myself in. After a quick shower to rinse off the grime, I examined the other objects more closely. The marble was smooth and cool, with a swirl of green and gold inside that reminded me of the marbles I used to collect as a kid. The matchbox was from a bar downtown I hadn't visited in years, and I couldn't fathom how it ended up in my pocket. But it was the café receipt that pulled me in the most. Something about it felt off, like a thread begging to be tugged. With a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, I decided to investigate. If I'd really been to Lila's Café, maybe retracing my steps would jog my memory, or at least provide some answers. Lila's Café wasn't far, only about a 15-minute walk. As I approached, the warm aroma of coffee and baked goods drifted through the air. It was a quaint little spot with flower boxes in the windows and a chalkboard sign out front advertising the daily specials. I hesitated at the door, nervous for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the clinking of mugs and the murmur of conversations. Behind the counter stood a cheerful-looking barista. Her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Hey, back so soon?" she said, her tone friendly. I blinked, caught off guard. Yeah," I stammered. "About last night." "You left in kind of a hurry," she continued, wiping her hands on a towel. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, my heart thudding. "Yeah, just had a lot on my mind." She nodded sympathetically. "Well, let me know if you need anything. Same table's open if you want it." I thanked her and found a seat by the window, my thoughts racing. If I'd been here last night, what had I said or done to make such an impression, and why couldn't I remember any of it? I pulled out the receipt again, scanning the details. 11:47 p.m. Well past my bedtime. The barista's words played in my head. "You left in kind of a hurry." What had prompted me to leave so abruptly? Lost in thought, I didn't notice the man approaching my table until he was standing right in front of me. He was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and a knowing smile. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, sliding into the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. I stared at him, utterly baffled. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" He chuckled. "Not exactly. You were in the park last night, right? By the fountain?" My stomach dropped. I don't remember." His smile faded. "You were acting strange. Talking to yourself. I thought maybe you'd had too much to drink, but you didn't smell like booze." You asked me if I'd seen the man with the green marble. I froze. The marble. My fingers instinctively brushed against it in my pocket. The man introduced himself as Greg and described our interaction in detail. According to him, I'd been wandering through the park around midnight, muttering about a man who had taken something important. I'd seemed agitated but harmless, so he hadn't called the police. Instead, he'd walked with me for a while, trying to make sense of my ramblings. I told you to go home, he said, but you just kept saying, I have to find him. The pieces didn't fit. I wasn't a sleepwalker, or at least I'd never thought I was. But how else could I explain the missing hours, the muddy shoes, and the strange objects? Determined to get to the bottom of things, I decided to visit the park Greg mentioned. It was the same park I walked through nearly every day, but this time it felt different. The fountain he described was empty. Its water shut off for the season, and the benches around it were eerily quiet. As I circled the area, I spotted something glinting on the ground near a bench. Picking it up, I realized it was another marble, identical to the one in my pocket. A shiver ran down my spine. What was happening? Was someone planting these objects? Or was it something deeper? Something my mind couldn't fully grasp. That night, I set up a camera in my bedroom, determined to capture whatever I was doing in my sleep. I fell asleep with the marble on my nightstand and the matchbox beside it, their presence both a comfort and a warning. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach churned. Around 11:30 p.m., I got out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the door, paused, and turned to look directly at the camera. My eyes were open, but they didn't look like mine. They were glassy, distant, as if I were staring at something, or someone, just beyond the lens. And then I spoke. He's waiting. The sound of my own voice on the recording sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the tone itself. It was soft, almost conversational. But the words didn't belong to me. They felt foreign, as though borrowed from someone or something else. He's waiting. Who was he? And where was he waiting? I rewound the video and watched again, pausing on the moment my eyes seemed to pierce through the lens. My expression was blank, yet somehow purposeful, as if I were answering a silent call only I could hear. The footage showed me leaving my bedroom moments later, stepping into the hallway. The screen went dark after that. I hadn't thought to set up additional cameras. I buried my face in my hands, my mind racing. Whatever was happening to me, it wasn't just sleepwalking. It was something deeper, something that seemed to have its own agenda. I needed answers, but I didn't even know where to begin. That afternoon, I returned to the park with the 2 marbles in my pocket. A vague hope pulling me there. The fountain stood silent, its edges dotted with fallen leaves. I circled it slowly, scanning the area for anything that might jog my memory. A sharp whistle broke the stillness, and I turned to see Greg leaning against a nearby tree. He waved me over, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Back for round 2?" he asked as I approached. I nodded. I need to figure out what happened that night. Greg studied me for a moment, then sighed. "You weren't just wandering aimlessly," he said. "You kept talking about the well." "The well?" I repeated, confused. "Yeah," he said. "You said you had to find the well before he did." A cold knot formed in my stomach. There was no well in this park, or at least none that I knew of. Yet something about the word felt familiar, as though it were tied to a half-forgotten memory. Greg offered to help me search, and together we combed the park, looking for any sign of a hidden well. It felt ridiculous at first, like chasing a childhood ghost story. But as we ventured deeper into the wooded area on the park's edge, the atmosphere changed. The air grew cooler, heavier, and the faint rustle of leaves seemed to carry whispers just beyond hearing. Then we found it. The well was old, its stone edges crumbling with age. Moss clung to its surface, and a wooden cover lay haphazardly across the top. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, my feet moving on their own. As I peered into the darkness below, a strange sensation washed over me, a mix of familiarity and dread. "He's waiting," I whispered, the words spilling from my lips without thought. Greg stepped back, his face pale. What did you just say? I turned to him, my pulse racing. I don't know, I admitted, but I think I've been here before. Determined to uncover whatever lay at the bottom of the well, we pried off the wooden cover and shone a flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed a damp, narrow shaft that descended farther than I could see. My heart pounded as the light flickered, casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. Greg handed me the flashlight. You're not seriously thinking of going down there, are you? I have to, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. I need to know what's down there. With his reluctant help, I tied a rope to a nearby tree and lowered myself into the well. The air grew colder as I descended, and the sound of dripping water echoed around me. My hands trembled as I gripped the rope, the flashlight's beam illuminating the narrow walls. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the well lay a small pile of objects, a third marble, another matchbox, and a tattered photograph. My breath caught as I picked up the photo. It was black and white, worn at the edges, and it showed a young boy standing beside the well. The boy was holding a marble. I climbed back to the surface, my mind swirling with questions. Greg helped me out of the well, his face a mask of worry. What did you find? He asked. I handed him the photo. His eyes widened as he studied it. This can't be real, he muttered. This looks like you. I stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? Greg held the photo up beside me. The resemblance was uncanny. The boy in the picture looked exactly like a younger version of me. That's impossible, I said, shaking my head. This photo has to be at least 50 years old. Greg frowned, his grip tightening on the photo. You said you've been sleepwalking, he said slowly. What if you weren't just walking? What if you were drawn here? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Was the well calling to me? And if so, why? As night fell, I sat in my apartment, the marbles, matchboxes, and photos spread out before me. Each object felt like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. Then it hit me. The marbles, the matchboxes, they weren't random. They were breadcrumbs, leading me back to the well, back to the boy in the photo. And the boy wasn't just connected to the well. The boy was me. Somehow, impossibly, the well had tied me to its history, its secrets. And as I stared at the photo, the boy's face seemed to shift, his expression morphing into a faint, knowing smile. I realized with chilling certainty, the well wasn't just a place, it was a tether, pulling me back to a life or a mystery I was never meant to leave behind. And the question that haunted me most was no longer who was waiting for me, it was why. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the cold. The chill of the concrete floor seeped through my clothes, biting into my skin like an unwelcome embrace. My head throbbed as though I'd been in a fight, and when I opened my eyes, all I saw was darkness. Panic clawed at my chest as I fumbled for my phone, its screen illuminating the narrow, claustrophobic space around me. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, their metallic surfaces slick with condensation. The walls were bare concrete, damp and gray. I was in a utility room, and I had no idea how I'd gotten there. The door was locked. I tried the handle again and again, the metal cold and unyielding beneath my grip. My phone's battery was low, just 12%, so I resisted the urge to call anyone right away. Instead, I tried to piece together the fragments of memory that floated hazily in my mind. The last thing I remembered was going to bed. I'd been tired, more exhausted than usual after a long day of work. I had no reason to leave my apartment, let alone wind up here, locked away like a forgotten secret. A glance at my phone told me it was 3:47 a.m. A wave of unease washed over me. Why here? Why now? I sat against the wall, listening to the faint hum of the building's boiler. My breaths were shallow, the air tasting faintly metallic. And then, just as I began to spiral into fear, a memory surfaced. A fleeting, fractured image. I had been standing in the hallway outside my apartment, barefoot. The memory was vague, like a dream, but the sensation was vivid. The chill of the floor, the sound of my own footsteps echoing as I walked. But walked where? I tried the door one last time, jiggling the handle in frustration, and then my fingers brushed against something. A key, taped to the underside of the doorknob. I hesitated. Why was it there? Pushing the thought aside, I used the key to unlock the door. It swung open with a creak, revealing the dimly lit basement corridor of my apartment building. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with numbered utility doors identical to the one I'd just exited. I stepped out cautiously, my bare feet cold against the tile. My phone's light barely cut through the gloom, and the building was eerily silent except for the occasional groan of the pipes. As I made my way to the elevator, another flash of memory stopped me in my tracks. This time, I saw myself standing in front of a door that wasn't mine. My hand was raised, knocking softly. But whose door was it? By the time I reached my apartment, the first streaks of dawn were creeping through the windows. My heart raced as I sat at my desk, laptop open, pulling up the security footage from the building's shared server. The cameras recorded 24/7, capturing the comings and goings of tenants. I scrolled through the footage, fast-forwarding to the early hours of the morning, and there I was at 2:15 a.m. stepping out of my apartment. I was barefoot, my hair disheveled, wearing the same clothes I'd gone to bed in. But something was off. I wasn't wandering aimlessly, as I might have expected. Instead, I moved with purpose, heading straight to the elevator. I watched myself press the button, step inside, and descend to the basement level. When I exited the elevator, I turned down the hallway, stopping in front of a door labeled Utility Room 3. I stood there for a moment, unmoving, before pulling a key from my pocket. I paused the footage. Why did I have a key to that room? The next step was obvious. I needed to go back. This time, I made sure to bring a flashlight and my apartment keys. The utility room was exactly as I'd left it, cold, damp, and empty, save for the pipes and an old maintenance log sitting on a shelf. I scanned the room carefully, looking for anything I might have missed earlier. And then, tucked behind one of the pipes, I found it. A small notebook. The cover was plain black, the pages filled with neat handwriting that wasn't mine. I flipped through, my pulse quickening as I read the entries. They described someone's sleepwalking episodes in vivid detail. Their confusion, the strange places they woke up, the things they didn't remember doing. And then on the last page, a single sentence stood out, written in shaky, urgent script. He's watching me when I sleep. My heart pounded as I closed the notebook. Was this connected to my own sleepwalking? Or was it something darker, something I couldn't explain? I returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me and double-checking the windows. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the pipes set my nerves on edge. At 7 a.m., I made a decision. I called the building manager, explaining that I needed to know more about the utility rooms. At first, he was dismissive, but when I mentioned the notebook, his tone changed. Those rooms haven't been used in years, he said. They were sealed off after an incident. What kind of incident? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. A tenant disappeared. They were never found. Over the next few days, I delved deeper into the building's history, uncovering whispers of strange occurrences, missing items, unexplained noises, tenants reporting feelings of being watched. The pieces began to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to believe. The notebook wasn't just a record of someone's experiences. It was a warning, and I have absolutely no idea how I became a part of it. I haven't sleepwalked since. But every night, as I lie in bed, I wonder if it's really over, or if I'm just waiting for the next time the locked door calls to me. The first time I woke up outside, I chalked it up to stress. Sleepwalking wasn't entirely foreign to me. I'd been known to wander as a child, my parents often finding me curled up on the living room floor or sitting by the front door. But as I grew older, the episodes stopped. Until a few weeks ago. It started small, waking up with dirt on my hands or blades of grass stuck to my feet. Then came the scratches, thin and crisscrossing my arms, as if I'd stumbled through branches. Each time I dismissed it as a fluke, telling myself it was harmless. But then, one night, I woke up under the massive oak tree in my backyard. I remember the sensation of cool earth against my palms, the dew soaking through my pajamas. The air was damp, tinged with the sharp scent of pine and soil. My heart raced as I realized where I was, outside, staring up at the dark canopy of the tree that had stood sentinel over my yard for as long as I could remember. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the yard, but beyond the tree line, the woods were a shadowy abyss. A breeze stirred the leaves, making them rustle like whispers. I didn't know how I got there. My house stood silent behind me, its windows dark. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, my breath shallow and quick. I brushed off the incident, convinced it was a one-time occurrence. But it wasn't. Over the next week, I woke up outside 3 more times. Each time, I was closer to the woods. I began to dread falling asleep. Every night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I even considered tying myself to the bed, but the thought made me feel ridiculous. Instead, I set up a camera in my bedroom, hoping it would capture what I was doing. The footage was unsettling. Around 2 a.m., I sat up in bed, my movements eerily calm. I walked to the back door, unlocking it with an ease that made me shiver. Then I stepped into the yard, disappearing from view. Each time I woke up outside, I felt an inexplicable pull toward the woods, like an invisible thread was tugging me closer. The night it happened, the air was thick with humidity, and a fog clung to the ground like a ghostly veil. I fell asleep restless, uneasy, as if I could sense what was coming. When I woke, I was standing. The grass was cool beneath my feet, the world bathed in silver moonlight. My body felt heavy, sluggish, as though I were underwater. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, melodic, but just beyond the edge of comprehension. It wasn't coming from the house. It wasn't coming from the tree. It was coming from the woods. I realized I was speaking, my lips moving of their own accord. The words felt foreign, tumbling from my mouth like leaves caught in a breeze. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt them. The presence was palpable, pressing against my skin like static electricity. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my chest tightened with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words cracking in my throat. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it laughed, a soft, lilting sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. The next morning, I found myself farther from the oak tree than ever before. My feet were caked in mud, my pajamas torn. Scratches marred my arms and legs, and my head throbbed as though I'd been running for hours. The woods loomed just beyond the yard, their edges blurred by the early morning mist. I spent the day trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a dream? A hallucination? But the physical evidence was undeniable. Something was drawing me toward those woods, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know why. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the edge of my yard, staring into the forest. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows long and twisting. For the first time, I felt the pull even while awake. The night I crossed into the forest was the last night I would know peace. I woke up standing among the trees, their towering forms blotting out the moonlight. The air was cool, tinged with the earthy scent of moss and decay. I was barefoot, the ground uneven and littered with twigs that snapped beneath my weight. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, pulsing like a heartbeat. I stumbled toward it, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing a clearing in the woods. At the center stood a figure. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but its presence was overwhelming. It radiated an energy that made the air hum, my skin prickling with static. "You've come," it said, its voice resonating like a distant echo. I didn't want to. I replied, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as though studying me. But you did. You always do. What do you want from me? It didn't answer. Instead, it extended a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, beckoning me closer. When I woke up the next morning, I was back in my yard, lying beneath the oak tree. But something had changed. A small object rested in my palm. A stone, smooth and cool to the touch, etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The pull of the woods was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had marked me in some way. The stone sat on my nightstand, its presence both comforting and ominous. I never sleepwalked again, but every so often I'd catch myself staring at the woods, the memory of the figure etched into my mind. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees, I swore I could still hear its voice, calling my name. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I woke up to find the faint smell of turpentine in the air, that sharp, almost metallic scent I usually associated with long hours spent in my studio. My hands felt sticky, my fingertips tinged with smudges of color, reds, blues, greens, the kind of stains that cling stubbornly even after a good scrubbing. But I hadn't painted in weeks. My easel stood in its usual corner of the studio, the canvas propped up and angled slightly toward the sunlight streaming through the window. At first, I thought it was the same blank canvas I'd left there last month when my creative spark fizzled out. But it wasn't blank anymore. It was a portrait, unfinished, but already vivid. The face of a woman stared back at me, her eyes half-formed, her expression hauntingly serene. The brushstrokes were bold yet delicate, layers of shadow and light, giving the image a depth I'd never achieved in my work before. I felt a strange sense of disconnection looking at it. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even, but it wasn't mine. At least, I didn't remember painting it. I rubbed my temples, trying to recall anything from the night before. Had I been inspired? Had I finally broken through the creative block that had kept me from the canvas for so long? But my mind was blank. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to the painting. I stared at it for hours, studying every stroke, every detail. It felt like the work of someone else, someone far more skilled than I'd ever been. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, exhausted. But when I woke up the next morning, there was a new painting waiting for me. This time it was a landscape, a dense, misty forest bathed in an eerie twilight. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, their twisted branches forming shapes that looked almost like figures if you stared too long. Again, I had no memory of painting it. The brushes were cleaned and neatly arranged, the palette wiped down. Whoever or whatever was doing this was meticulous. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. I'd go to bed, my studio quiet and untouched, and every morning there'd be a new piece waiting for me. Each one was more intricate than the last. A crumbling cathedral bathed in moonlight, its stained glass windows glowing with otherworldly colors. A lone figure standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a roiling, stormy sea. A pair of hands reaching out from the darkness, their fingers clawed and desperate. The themes were dark, melancholy, almost tragic. They weren't just paintings, they were stories. And yet I felt like an outsider looking in, like I was stealing glimpses of someone else's memories. I set up a camera in my studio, determined to uncover what was happening. The first night, I sat in bed, staring at my phone screen as the live feed from the camera played. The studio was quiet, the easel standing still in its corner. For hours, nothing happened. And then at 3:14 a.m., I appeared. I watched as I walked into the studio, my movements slow and deliberate. My eyes were open, but they didn't look like mine. There was a vacant, faraway expression on my face. I picked up a brush, dipped it into the paint, and began to work. For hours, I painted in complete silence, my strokes precise and fluid. When the painting was done, I stepped back, cleaned my tools, and left the studio as if nothing had happened. Watching myself like that was unsettling, to say the least. The next morning, I reviewed the footage again, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. But all it did was raise more questions. The painting I'd created that night was unlike anything I'd ever attempted before. It showed a room, dimly lit with cracked walls and a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a figure, their face obscured by shadows. It felt disturbingly familiar, though I couldn't place why. Desperate for answers, I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I could remember from the nights before. But the more I tried to piece things together, the more fragmented my memories became. One night, as I lay in bed on the edge of sleep, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves or the murmur of distant voices, but it grew louder, more distinct. "Keep going." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, but the whisper lingered in my mind, its tone both soothing and commanding. That night, I didn't sleep. When I entered the studio the next morning, I knew something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. On the easel was the last painting. It showed me, sitting in my studio, brush in hand, surrounded by the paintings I'd created. But there was something behind me, a shadowy figure, its form barely visible but unmistakably present. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I turned around, half expecting to see it standing there. But the room was empty. I haven't painted since that day. The works I created during those sleepless nights remain in my studio, covered with sheets to keep them hidden. I can't bring myself to look at them, but I can't get rid of them either. Sometimes I wonder if I was meant to find them, if they were meant to tell me something. Other times, I think they were never mine to begin with, that I was simply a vessel for something else. And on the nights when I can't sleep, I sit in the studio, staring at the blank canvas on the easel, waiting, because deep down, I know it isn't over. They say the past never truly leaves you. Sometimes, I wish it would. It started after I moved back into my childhood home. The place had been vacant for years after my parents moved to Florida, leaving the house to gather dust and memories. When they offered to let me stay there while I sorted out my life, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like the perfect escape, familiar and quiet, far from the noise of the city. I didn't know that coming back would awaken something inside me. The first sleepwalking episode happened a week after I moved in. I woke up in the attic, shivering. My bare feet were covered in dust, and a soft beam of moonlight filtered through the small circular window, casting shadows on the cluttered space. Around me were boxes I didn't remember opening. Old books, photo albums, and knickknacks lay scattered on the wooden floor. A faint scent of mothballs and aged paper filled the air. My heart raced as I tried to piece together how I'd ended up there. I could vaguely recall snippets of movement, like walking up the creaky stairs in a dream. But it was all fragmented, hazy. Shrugging it off as stress, I closed the boxes, descended the stairs, and climbed back into bed. But it didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the episodes became more frequent. Every time I'd wake up in the attic, always surrounded by the same collection of boxes. Sometimes I'd find specific items pulled out. A porcelain doll with a chipped face, an old journal with a broken clasp, a faded Polaroid of a young boy holding a toy truck. I wasn't just wandering aimlessly. I was searching for something. Determined to understand what was happening, I started recording myself at night. The first time I reviewed the footage, my skin crawled. Around 2 a.m., I got out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate. I watched myself climb the attic stairs, open a box, and sift through its contents with a strange sense of urgency. And then I spoke. It was barely audible, a single word whispered into the quiet. Why? During the day, I began inspecting the objects I'd unconsciously pulled out. Each one felt like it belonged to a story I couldn't quite remember. The porcelain doll had been my sister's. I hadn't thought of her in years. She passed away when I was 10. Her name rarely mentioned after that. The journal belonged to my mother, filled with scribbled recipes and notes about mundane things like grocery lists and laundry schedules. The Polaroid, however, was a mystery. The boy in the photo wasn't me. His face was unfamiliar, and there was no name or date written on the back. The attic began to change at night. I started hearing things, soft whispers that seemed to come from the shadows. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the echoes of dreams I couldn't quite shake off. But one night, as I stood in the attic, fully awake, I heard it clearly. Find it. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The attic was silent again, the only sound the distant creak of the house settling. The turning point came when I found the music box. It was tucked away in a corner of the attic, hidden beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. The moment I opened it, a hauntingly familiar melody filled the room. I was flooded with a wave of emotion so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I couldn't place why, but the tune stirred something deep inside me. An aching, bittersweet feeling, like longing for a home you've never been to. And then I remembered. I was 5 years old, playing in the backyard with my sister Emily. She'd found the music box in the attic and brought it down to show me. I'd been fascinated by the way the tiny ballerina spun in circles to the tinkling tune. That day we'd argued. I'd wanted to hold the music box, but Emily wouldn't let me. In my frustration, I'd shoved her. She'd fallen. The memory hit me like a thunderclap. I remembered the sickening crack as she hit her head on the stone patio, the way she'd lain there, so still. I'd screamed for my mother, who came running, her face pale with terror. Emily survived the fall, but suffered a concussion. She was never the same after that, quieter, more withdrawn. A year later, she passed away in her sleep. I had buried the memory deep, convinced myself it wasn't my fault. But now, standing in the attic, it all came rushing back. I turned my attention to the Polaroid, the image of the boy gnawing at the edges of my mind. If Emily was the reason for the music box, then who was he? I showed the photo to my parents during a visit. My mother's face darkened as she took it in. "That's Peter," she said softly. "Who?" "Your brother." The revelation stunned me. I didn't have a brother. At least, I didn't think I did. "He was born before you," my father explained. "He died when he was 6. We never talked about him. It was too painful." It all began to make sense. The attic wasn't just a repository for old things. It was a vault for forgotten memories, a place where the past lingered, waiting to be uncovered. My sleepwalking episodes weren't random. They were my mind's way of forcing me to confront the truths I'd buried. I spent the next few weeks going through every box in the attic, piecing together the fragments of my family's story. Each item held a memory, a connection to the people I'd loved and lost. One night, as I stood in the attic, the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't menacing. They were soft, almost comforting. "It's okay," they seemed to say. "You found us." I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The attic is quiet now. The boxes are still there, but I no longer feel the compulsion to open them. I've made peace with the memories they hold, with the ghosts of my past. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the faint strains of the music box's melody. But instead of fear, it brings a sense of calm, a reminder that the past doesn't have to haunt you forever.